Welcome to episode 10 of Geoff and Heather's Dahlia Diary. It's the middle of July and the garden's really starting to grow well now. This is how the garden looked on June the 19th, just after I'd planted all the dahlias out. And this is how exactly the same patch is looking now. As you can see, it's moved on. We've had quite a lot of rain, but plenty of sunny days too, so the garden's really starting to motor. I'm pretty confident that most of the dahlias are going to grow tall enough so that they cover up the stakes behind them. As you can see, I'm having to spend quite a bit of time at the moment tying them up. In this episode, I originally planned to show you lots of dahlias in flower and talk about the individual varieties, but it's a bit early for that and I've got so much to tell you that I thought I'd better make this episode now. As well as telling you about some of the jobs we've been doing, I'm going to tell you about some of the problems we've faced and how we've dealt with them. Those of you who like that sort of thing will particularly enjoy Heather talking to you about smut. It's the 29th of June and here in the greenhouse, at long last the lobelia are starting to grow. Well, a bit. And the Durango marigolds are doing quite well. So I'm hoping that sometime in July I'll be able to plant them out at the front of the borders and finish off all the planting out. Outside, the salvias are starting to do quite well. They're starting to move and I'm having to put hoops in to support them. I've got lots of different sized hoops. I find them very useful. I like the plastic coated sort. I'm not into the rusty kind that are trendy at the moment. I don't get that. This salvia is starting to move. It's Cerro Potosi, which I know is going to grow to about 3 foot. So I'm going to put a hoop on it now. I left a note to remind myself to put the hoops in early this year. Last year I left them a bit long and the plants were too straggly before I put them on, so quite a few of the branches broke off. Now you might think that the hoop's a bit too big for the plant. Well, it probably is at the moment, but the plant will grow into it. In the meantime, it'll give me something to trip over. A salvia I really like is this one. I've grown it for a few years, but unfortunately, quite early on I lost the label, so I don't know what it's called. At the moment I just call it Pest Pink. If anyone knows its proper name, I'd be very grateful if you could tell me. For the first time I tried overwintering it outside in the garden, and it's doing really well. It's in flower now and it's about 3.5 feet tall as it grew last year overall. It's one of those varieties of salvia which throws out lots of shoots from the base. I had an old packet of lavatera seeds. Only 6 of them came up. I've decided that I'm going to plant them between some of the dahlias. I've found in the past that the pink lavateras peeking out from between the dahlias makes quite a nice effect. I've still got a bit of compost left at the bottom of the compost heap. I'm going to wet it and put it under each lavatera plant. That'll help the plants get established and also encourage them to put their roots downwards rather than sideways. This is the secluded area where I plant my pot tubers. It's actually directly under a sycamore tree, so it's relatively on the dry side, but it does okay. Prior to planting out the pot tubers, I always dig this area over. I don't dig in general, but this area is the one place I do dig. I like to get the soil very soft so that when it comes to planting out 200 odd pot tubers, it's easier to do than trying to dig into solid ground. Heather said that she'd have a go, but I bet it's on the hard side for her. Thought so. I think I've dug sufficient there for the job. I can't deny that it's pretty poor quality soil and it's tempting to incorporate some organic matter, some compost or whatever. That would help the ground maintain the moisture for longer, but nevertheless I think that would be a mistake. You need to bear in mind that the whole purpose of a pot tuber is to do just that, to produce a tuber within the pot, and if you incorporated organic matter, the danger is that the tuber would get out of the pot and get through, and then when you try to take it through the ground, the tuber will break off. Also, there's a danger that organic matter will make the plant produce more green shoots when what you're trying to do is produce a tuber. We've lived in this house for nearly 45 years, and every year, for one reason or another, I've dug this particular piece of ground. And yet, without fail, I always dig up at least one piece of glass or a couple. And look how sharp this is. It's been there for at least 45 years, obviously for a lot more I would have thought, and yet it's not lost its sharpness. When they talk about how long it takes for plastic to biodegrade, I can't help thinking about how long it takes a piece of glass just to lose its edge, never mind biodegrade. I'm afraid this is true of the rest of the garden, not just this particular patch. I'm always finding bits of sharp glass, and quite often I'm walking around and suddenly there's a piece of glass on the top of the soil that I've never seen before. How did it get there? It must have been there for years, but I've never seen it. I've raked it all now. Doesn't it look neat and tidy? Heather likes things to be neat and tidy. I think that's what attracted her to me.
How wrong I was.
Now these holes, folks, were made by earwigs. In the mornings you can sometimes find them nestling in the leaves. Or sometimes behind the leaves on the stake. Some growers would advise you to put Vaseline on the bottom of the stems. The idea being that the earwigs don't like going over the Vaseline. Others would suggest that you use ant powder. Put ant powder at the bottom of the stem. Ant powder kills earwigs as well as ants. I've read that in the USA there is a product that you can buy that attracts earwigs and kills them. Unfortunately, it's not available in the UK. So in the main, for me, it's a case of if I see them, squash them. When I was younger and more keen, I used to go out at night with a flashlight because that's when they're most active. I can't be bothered anymore. Once the dahlias are planted out, I like to wash the plant pots in a mixture of soap and disinfectant. It gets rid of the bugs and it also makes the plant pots easier to store in the greenhouse. That last bit was a joke, by the way, we're not so obsessed. In the greenhouse, the pot tubers, they're growing pretty well, and some of them are getting so tall I better get started planting them out. The first thing I do is install my support system. The dahlias that are put out in the garden, I like to have one stake per plant, but it's not realistic to have 225 stakes for 225 little dahlias, so I use a lattice system which I'll show you as I go along. I'm growing them in rows of 8, with the tallest ones right at the back, so that the short ones will be near the front when I get round to planting them and they'll get more sunlight. So that's it, the first row of 8 all planted out just below the surface, and with the labels pressed in so that the birds don't pull them out. And that's the second row finished. I can't deny that they are close together, but bear in mind the aim of this is to convince the plants that they're about to die, so they'll produce a tuber. No, I'm not trying to persuade you that this is the right way to do it. I'm sure that other dahlias growers would tell you something different. I know some people keep their dahlias outside the ground altogether. They just water them every day and keep them on concrete. But this works for me. I don't have to water them so much. And I've found that it works quite well. And that's it. The first 5 rows done in next to no time. I'm glad I dug the soil over before I started. It's made that a lot easier. Now after each 5 rows I put some extra supports in. And now I'm going to use some polypropylene string to make a zigzag support system. Now I hope you can see the crisscross string. That'll hold the plants for a week or so, but as they get taller I'm going to have to put another layer of string in as they get higher. And that's the third batch of 40 done. I'm going to leave the rest for a few days because they're on the small side. It's better to get them a bit taller so they can hold their own. Though I've learned to put up with earwigs, you can't afford to do that with slugs and snails. I've just seen I always use slug pellets, spread them all over the place, but there's a patch in the front garden which always gets badly affected, and no matter what I try to do, they get eaten. It's funny because they only seem to eat a couple of plants, the rest of the garden seems unaffected. All I can say is keep on top of the snails because they'll go and live in your dahlias, and keep the slugs down as best you can. It's the 11th of July. At long last I've planted out the last of my pot tubers. It's a good 2 weeks since I planted out the first ones, and already the first ones have had to have the second layer of string because they're getting taller. Whereas some of the ones I've just planted out are on the small side. I've not kept records from previous years, but I suspect the 11th of July is quite late, so it's going to be interesting to see whether any of these later ones actually develop a tuber. I'll keep you in touch. One of the jobs I enjoy doing in July, much more than digging or plant pot washing, is weed zapping. I've got a tool called a weed wand which runs on butane gas, and I use it for zapping all the weeds. I particularly like zapping the ones that I sowed myself many years ago. There's a plant called the shoe fly plant or Nicandra which I grew, must be 20 years ago, and every year the seeds germinate and get in the way, so I go around with my weed wand and zap them just like that. Goodbye. Similarly, about 10 years ago I grew a plant called an echium, which is a blue flower which comes up again and again, and so I frazzle that too. And finally, probably the worst of the lot is a plant called Love Lies Bleeding, or amaranthus. It's a dark red tassel-y type plant. Keeps coming up, and so I have to say my fond farewell by giving it a bit of a singe.
Since we planted the dahlias out, the weather has been pretty warm and dry. But now we're having a spell of wet weather, even though the temperatures are still on the warm side. The combination of warmth and rain are making the plants grow really fast now, and they need to be tied up regularly so they don't fall over in the breeze. Warm and wet weather brings the risk of fungal disease to young dahlias. Powdery mildew thrives in these conditions, but Geoff's hoping that regular spraying the plants with SB Plant Invigorator will hold the mildew at bay. Perhaps a bigger concern now is the possibility of the plants getting attacked by the dreaded dahlia smut disease. This clip was taken a few years ago when we had a really wet summer. The spots on the leaves are caused by the smut fungus. That year we failed to keep on top of the disease, and although the plants didn't die, they looked pretty ugly. The spores of the dahlia smut fungus live in the soil and only become active when the soil gets wet. The rain splashes the spores onto the backs of the leaves where they cause havoc. So really heavy rain like we're having today is probably the ideal conditions for creating a little bit of smut. Geoff's hoping that spraying with SB Plant Invigorator will prevent smut this year, but he's also bought a few other fungicides to try if necessary. Otherwise he'll have to take off the affected leaves and put them in the bin. He couldn't put them on the compost heap because the spores will stay there until next year.
I'm in the greenhouse now, looking at the marigolds I've got ready, more or less ready to plant out. Can you see this funny growth coming from inside the compost? I've now taken the plants out of the tray. As you can see, it's some sort of a fungus. I guess the experts would call it mycelium. I'm guessing that it's something to do with the fact that I grew these marigolds in compost that was made from recycled material rather than the usual peat. Presumably the spores were already in there. It's obviously not affected the growth of the marigolds, they're okay. But it's left me wondering about how I'm going to store my dahlia tubers over winter. I always store them covered in potting compost. Should I be using this sort of stuff? Will it make the tubers likely to rot? I'm beginning to wonder. This is the first dahlia to come into bloom. It's a dwarf growing one called Art Deco. Unlike so many of the dwarf ones that you see on sale, this one's fully double. It doesn't have an open centre. I like that. And coincidentally, the second one to come into bloom is called Art Nouveau, which is actually Art Deco's sister plant. I love them both for the vibrant colours and the fact that they're easy to grow. The only trouble is they do attract earwigs. If you look closely, one of the petals on this one's already been nibbled. The earwigs seem particularly fond of Art Deco. When the blooms start to fade and start going brown, then they gather in the back of the flower. The good news though is that when you deadhead the flower, the earwigs are easy to get off. In a way, I use these dwarf dahlias as bait for earwigs so that they don't go on to the taller growing ones and spoil the better blooms. The final dwarf dahlia that I want to show you is this one. If you think it looks like Art Deco, it's because it's actually the child of Art Deco. It was raised by a good friend of mine called Ken Stock, who raised some wonderful dahlias in his back garden in Bournemouth. He produced dahlias from seed. He hand-pollinated varieties so that he got the cross that he wanted. If you're interested in seeing his garden, I made a video in 2013. It's entitled Ken Stock Garden, 25th of October 2013. I think you'll be amazed by how many flowers he got into a relatively small back garden. This is a variety called Hadrian's Midnight. It's quite a short plant and it's got dark leaves. It was bred by Halls of Heddon up in the northeast of England. And at long last, the first of the taller growing varieties is coming into bloom. It's a pink collarette variety called Edith Jones. A collarette has got an extra set of florets around the centre of the bloom. I think it's a rather pretty one and they attract bees. It's the 13th of July and at long last the day's arrived where I'm going to get the last of the bedding plants planted out. The Durango marigolds are a good size, but the lobelias are still a bit on the short side, but I can't wait any longer, I've had enough. I'm sick of watering them. Even in the lobelia I've got some of these weird mushroom things growing, but I don't think they're going to affect the plants. Well, that's it for episode 10, folks. Next episode I'm hoping to have lots of dahlias to show you. I'll be telling you about all the good ones that have come into bloom. In the meantime, we're all going to take a rest. Well, one of us has already got started.